So tonight we are going to get to the mountain. The last 4 weeks we've looked at some various parts of the Exodus story, the narrative around the plagues, the origin point. We've posited this question, where is the real Mount Sinai? Is it actually in the Sinai Peninsula or is it in Arabia? Tonight I'm going to show you the evidence in geography for that. I've been showing you evidence for the Mount Sinai location prior to this through the scriptural accounts, through the geographic analysis of the Yam Suf, or the Sea of Termination, the crossing site, some interesting things in the coral formations in the Red Sea or the Sea of Termination. If you Google this on the internet, that's probably the first thing you're going to find is the coral chariot wheels in the bottom of the Red Sea. I don't spend a lot of time on that, mainly because a lot of that information is kind of dubious, and it's the least of the information, in my opinion, that presents Mount Sinai in Arabia. But really, the reason we've been doing this isn't just to say, hey, look at the new discovery, the mountain's real. The point of this is to get rooted in the Exodus narrative, to get rooted in the scriptures, to have the Bible come alive, because we begin to see the place, and we begin to see the people, and we begin to hear the ancient stories that stop becoming history about a dead group of people, and it becomes memory of a shared experience that we're all having. And, you know, a bulk of this group in this room is all working on a similar project, and we're developing a memory of a shared experience that this narrative in the scriptures, that God leads people through and out and twists and turns and traps them so that he can reveal things in them, so he can do through them what he wants in the world, so other people tell the stories. Like, all of this is for that purpose. And tonight is a big night, and I got a lot to cover, so maybe I don't need to do my long preambles. But this is the money shot. Right? This is the big payoff. This is the reason that everyone came out of Egypt. Repeatedly, God said to Moses, go tell Pharaoh to let my people go so that they may come worship me here at the mountain. That's what all this has been about, getting to the spot where they worship him at the mountain. Now, unfortunately at the mountain, John was not able to play keys and sing. There was another kind of worship that was happening at the mountain, a less modern liturgical worship. So if all of this was geared towards worshiping at the mountain, we probably need to stop and look at, well, what happened when they first got to the mountain? What happened at the mountain? What did God do? What did he reveal to them? How did he array them? How did he line them up? If you've ever worked in production for a Sunday service, I know there's some in here that have done that, you know that all of the little parts and pieces, everything that you do to produce and set up, it's either done from a place of, self-obsession and pride, or it's done to create an environment of worship for people, to break down barriers to entry so that they can come and connect to God. So that the sound's not too loud or too soft, the lights aren't too bright or too dim, the fog machine's not too dense to be able to see the lead guitarist. Like, there's important things you need to put in place so that there's not barriers to worship. So this is what I believe that God is doing, and it's the context for what we're going to talk about tonight. So first I'm going to show you some scriptural stuff, and we're going to look at the Ten Commandments in a unique way that you probably have not looked at before. We're going to talk about the scripture. Then I'm going to show you a lot of video footage and images and analysis of these artifacts and structures that are around this proposed mountain. There's 5 or 6 of them I can show you tonight with some really great imagery, which I'm very excited about. And then I'll take you on Google Earth, and we'll see the maps and the geography, and we'll show you all of that as well. Sound good? All right, winner, chicken dinner. All right, so the Ten Commandments, I've said this briefly before, but the Ten Commandments are not God's law so that the people of Israel can be saved. This is not a law and rules that get given to Israel so that they get counted to be in the family of God. These commandments are not the things, it's not the litmus test for believers. Protestants have to say the sinner's prayer. Did the Jews have to memorize the 10 Commandments and then they were Jews? This is not about that. This is another kind of a story. And so we're going to look at the biblical text here, and I'm going to tell you the ancient history of what these 10 Commandments actually were. So to do that, we need to read the text. This is Exodus chapter 19, verses 16 through 20. On the morning of the third day, right before this, God told Moses, he went kind of up and down the mountain, and God told him to bring everybody up to the mountain. Set boundary markers around the mountain so they come up right to the base of it. There was a holy zone and there was a zone for the people. So there was a division immediately between the holy place and the people, which we see reinforced in the design of the tabernacle that comes a couple chapters later. So now on the third day, he says, wait 3 days, which is an interesting study to look at third day verses in the scriptures. On the third day, there were thunders and lightning and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. So they came up to the base of the mountain and took their stand. They were scared. This was a frightening experience. Up until this point, they'd seen the fire and the smoke, but it didn't talk to them. And it didn't blast trumpets. It led them out of Egypt, but it hadn't yet made noise. And so that's a little freaky. Now, Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. This is a major dramatic scene. That word smoke is an interesting one that connects to the covenant that God cuts with Abram in the very beginning. And the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, and Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. And the Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called to Moses, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. So this is a significant moment. This is the first time that we get a record outside of the Garden of Eden that God sets foot on the earth, that God comes down and touches the creation. And there's a couple really significant things about that we don't have time to get into tonight, but trying to get a sense of the grandeur, the scale of this moment. Not like, oh yeah, God came down in fire and then gave us, rules that are superseded because Jesus. Like, this is a significant moment. So we'll continue on, and then he comes down and he speaks it, and then he speaks the 10 Commandments. And we're going to get into that. So I'm skipping ahead, Exodus 21 through 17 of the 10 Commandments and the pieces there, but I want to pick this detail up here, because this is an important part of an interpretive framework for us to understand what's happening here and what happens later. Exodus 20, verse 18 through 21. Now, when the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled. And they stood far off and said to Moses, "You speak to us and we'll listen, but don't let God speak to us lest we die." So Moses said to the people, "Do not fear, for God has come to test you, that you may fear him, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin." The people stood far off, while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. So the reason I show you Exodus 19 is that God tells all of the people to purify themselves for 3 days. He sets boundaries and draws them all right into the holy place. And he shows up in fire and thunder and fierce thunderings, and he speaks out in the hearing of all the people the 10 Commandments. This is how the 10 Commandments are first given. They're not given on stone to Moses alone in the darkness. They're thundered from the top of the mountain to all the people. This is a significant difference from what we may have learned in Sunday school. That God gave the Ten Commandments, and there's tablets, and we got Mel Brooks's version of the tablets coming down. Oh, we got these 10 commandments. That's not what's going on here. Now, if this is not a good question, but if you were God, which we're not, so I won't even think that way. What God is doing here is He set the people out so that He can come to Himself. They can worship me, and He's not just doing it because He wants this, pitiful little automaton worship. Like, He wants friends and partners. He wants an intimate relationship with these people. I've laid out the framework for that. So He draws them all to Himself. Why would He then only talk to one person and tell that one person everything? His first desire was that everyone in Israel would hear His voice. That everyone in Israel would hear the law. That everyone in Israel would be accountable to hearing the voice of God for themselves. But that scared everyone. They did not want prophetic ministry in their church. It was scary, right? And this time it's the people saying we don't want that instead of the pastor. So the people say, this is terrifying to hear God. We don't have a grid for this, right? The grid that they had for God in the previous generation is not a God who is being revealed now. And there's lots of reasons behind that, and we could go into that, and it's a valuable thing to think through. But notice that they said, all right, we need a mediator. God comes down in dramatic fashion to have an unmediated experience with humanity. And humanity's first experience with an unmediated connection to God is, let's put a pastor, an apostle, or a prophet, or someone in between us. This God is scary. If I hear His voice, I'm afraid I'm going to die. I'm belaboring this point because it begins here both to unravel and debunk some common misconceptions about the Old Testament, that God gave a mediated set of rules so that people could be saved. That was not God's desire, it seems, from the beginning. He had a different desire. And that's very helpful next week when we look at the sin consequences of this mountain. What happens here at the mountain. So God speaks to all of us. God is in the thick darkness. And Moses goes up into the thick darkness where God is. We get that same language when Abram goes into a deep, dark sleep. A thick, dark cloud comes over him, and he meets God, and the covenant gets cut. In I think it's Genesis. I think that record is, the Genesis 18 is the circumcision. It's 15. 15 is the covenantal. And that same word smoke in Genesis 15 is also in Sinai. And the thick darkness is also in Sinai. So this is a big covenantal moment. And then the Lord said, Exodus 20, 22 to 25, and then the Lord said to Moses, thus you shall say to the people of Israel. So now we've established a new norm. God speaks to everyone, the people freak out, they put Moses in there, and so God tells Moses, all right, tell the people. This is what we see, and it's God adjusting and adapting. Thus you shall say to the people of Israel, you have seen for yourselves that I have talked with you from heaven. They all heard him. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. And I think it's interesting that he says, you saw me, you all heard me speak from heaven, and the very next thing is, don't make idols. Somehow there is a connection between their fear of intimacy with God and the presence of idols in their lives. And we'll drive that point home next week. But there is a strong correlation between your ability and willingness to hear the voice of God and the idols that you hold on to in your life. Because when you hold on to idols in your life, God begins speaking, and those things immediately recognize the authority from God. And they run. You run from that. And we get, we're not going to do idolatry tonight. There's a lot on that, and we'll do it next week. So he says, all right, so you freaked out. You don't want an unmediated encounter with me. I tried to speak to you. You got idols in your life. Now I'm going to give you a framework so that you can come under your terms and worship me. So he begins to give them a structure for worship. And the rabbis go crazy with this little piece of passage because this is the first time that God gives instructions on how he wants to be worshiped. All the other times is Abram making an altar or Isaac doing something. God does give Abraham instructions to go and worship with the sacrifice. But the Lord says this in Exodus, I think this is 23, 22, 20, 23. God says, an altar of earth you will make for me and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. That's where they get the word for the temple, the place of my name. You'll see that throughout the rest of the scriptures. And if you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stones, for if you wield your tool on it, you profane it. So I want to talk about this for a second. One, because I like the word, that sentence. If you wield your tool on it, you profane it. It seems a little bit like a Monty Python kind of a phrase. You've wielded your tool. Yeah, sorry. You're wielding. You have not. You've got 2 empty coconuts and you're banging them together. That's what's going on in my head. Huh? Thank you. Someone was making fun of me last week. Said it wasn't very good. So,
I'm just honest.
So God says when you make an altar of stone, don't build it of hewn stones. So let's think about this for a moment. Who is he talking to? It's an easy question. But why is he telling the Hebrew people?
They've been doing that for Pharaoh.
Doing what?
Hewing
stones. This is what they're doing. They're building Pharaoh's cities. They're not pouring concrete and using hammers and nails. They're stonemasons. They're cutting rocks. They're building columns. These guys were excellent builders, very strong, and they were probably masters with stone cutting tools. And they gained their skill. Imagine if you're a slave and you don't have really any freedom in your life except the work that you do with your hands. And imagine you begin to erect these world-renowned, famous, maybe you're not the guy that has to make, benches in the city park. Maybe you're making Luxor or Karnak, or you're doing something for Pharaoh himself. There was great honor in wielding your tool to cut a stone, to build an altar to a pagan god. There's great honor in that. And if that's all you have, surely there's a few people in this room that have wrestled with the fact that you're not the things that you do at work. That your identity is not tied up in what you create and produce out in the world. Is anyone familiar with that struggle, that journey? This is what God's going at. He's telling slaves that built stone idols for Egypt, all right, we're doing a new worship thing, but it's not like what you did in Egypt. In fact, it's so not like that. The moment you start doing what you learned in Egypt, you ruin the worship. You profane it. You think that the things that you did in Egypt will come and bless me here? I'm showing you a whole new way of life, a whole new way of living. Now, he doesn't tell them don't do arts and crafts or don't do crafts, don't be craftsmen. The first instance in the scriptures of someone being filled with the Holy Spirit was Bezaleel and Aholiab, who were filled with the Spirit to make incredible works of craftsmanship for the Ark of the Covenant. So God was very intense about artistry and craftsmanship, and they got to use it. But here at this very first thing, God said, look, you're coming out of slavery. I need to teach you not just a different way of doing the old thing. We're doing a whole new thing. And when you create worship in Israel, it's not going to look like anything you've done in Egypt. So that'll be important when we get a little bit further on down the road. So I want to just take a look quickly at these 10 commandments, give you a little bit of interpretation on it, and then give you a little bit of history on the covenantal documents.
So Adam heard they'd done their peace and their burnt offerings previously.
Well, peace and burnt offerings don't appear. I mean, this is the beginning of the Levitical law and the structure that shows up on the temple. There have been offerings to God, sacrifices that Moses or that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob made, and we get records of that. But the specific peace offering and the burnt offering, those are the first two of 7 major offerings that are offered in the temple. Those are the only 2 offerings that were offered in David's tabernacle, too, by the way. There's never any sin offerings in David's tabernacle, and that's important to note. A burnt offering is like a fellowship offering. It's the thing that you eat, or that you give as like a community deal. And the peace offering, everybody that makes the offering gets to eat it in the Levitical law. So it's basically burnt offering, submission to God. Peace offering is communal harmony. Is a basic shorthand way to look at that. So we'll just read these just in case some of us didn't memorize them in 2nd grade. The 10 Commandments. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You will have no other gods before me. A lot of times if you have memorized this, you say, what's the first commandment? You will have no other gods before me. Well, no, that's not the first commandment. And this is important. Because God says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of bondage. You will have no other gods before me. When we divorce what God did for us and what he requires of us, we're separating out his promises from us. If we just talk about God's requirements and don't talk about what he provided, it's the same thing that he did with Abraham and Isaac. He demanded a sacrifice, but he provided a sacrifice. He demanded one at the Exodus and provided one. And the very first thing he does here is he says, I have provided for you, and now I'm asking of you something. Linking those two things together. So what God gives to us and what he's done for us are never separated. The second one here, you will not make for yourselves a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or is in the earth beneath, or that's in the water under the sea. Big one, don't make idols. Number 3, you will not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. I do want to look at this one for a second because there's something really neat in here. The Hebrew word vain is this word shav, and it means vanity, emptiness, nothingness, emptiness of speech, lying. So when we hear take the Lord's name in vain, we think of cursing, usually, right away. But the prophet Isaiah talks about using the Lord's name in vain like this. He says, you worship me with your lips, but your hearts are far from me. In vanity do you worship me. Jesus quotes Isaiah when he levels a charge against the scribes and Pharisees, that you worship me with your lips, but your hearts are far from me. That's vanity. There's a verse in Micah where it basically says, would that I shut the doors of the temple rather than you come in here and kindle fire on my altar in vain. What is taking the Lord's name in vain? It's coming to God, calling on his name without having your heart engaged in what you're doing. I think there's a lot of cursing that goes on in the Christian church on Sunday morning. In a lot of places. That we come in and we kindle fire on God's altar with nothingness in our heart. And this is a big deal. The other part of this, when you cry out to idols, it's taking the Lord's name in vain. Right? Because there's nothingness in there. You're crying out to something that's dead. It's empty. Maybe you're not crying out to God, but if you've got an idol in your life and it's in the way of your connection to God and you're crying out to God, but there's nothing there because you're worshiping an idol, idolatry creates vanity, emptiness, nothingness. And this is important for the Hebrews for them to understand. Look, don't make an idol, because when you make idols, that'll tempt your heart away from me, and all of your worship with me will be in vain. There's a pattern here that builds.
Is this the origin of why we say no swearing or no cursing?
Yes.
This is originally
This is it.
came from, isn't it?
Yes.
So actually it's really just a redefinition of what that is, because it's not
Yeah,
everyday language nowadays.
no.
It's not really that.
No. Paul talks to Timothy about not letting any impure things out of your mouth, have nothing to do with that. And there was most certainly the use of language to curse is a very real thing. But it's not about not saying words. The rabbis have this phrase called lashon haran, and it means murder with the lips. And it's one of the worst things that you can do. This is what slander and gossip do. When you talk about someone to try and elevate them with emptiness or hatred or lying speech, that those are akin for the rabbinic traditions to murdering the body, because you're murdering with your mouth. And James picks up those motifs about the power of the tongue and who can tame the power of the tongue. The conclusion is, well, no person can tame the power of the tongue. This is something that God's got to do. Why? Well, you worship him, have no other gods, get rid of the idols in your life, and all of a sudden this vain speech with nothingness, that all begins to erode because you're connected to him. You want to stop taking the Lord's name in vain? Get connected to him. Learn how to do that. Like, we don't try and stop doing this. We try and connect so that the life of God drives out the emptiness of our speech and of our hearts, right? There's a couple ways to kill weeds. You can pull them out, or you can grow healthy grass and choke them out. Sometimes it's good to do both. So the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you will labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is Sabbath of the Lord your God. So the work belongs to you. The Sabbath is God's. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. This is the only day that God ever blessed. You do a whole teaching on that and the Sabbath, and maybe at some point we should look at the Sabbath. This is the foundation of the law. The Sabbath is the foundation of the law and all the festivals. Verse 5, honor your father and mother, honor your parents, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God gives you. There's a connection between honoring mom and dad and inheriting and possessing your territory. We'll talk about that. Verse 5, now things take a pretty significant turn. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, his donkey, nor anything that's your neighbor's. Did you guys see the turn? We went from, oh shoot. I need to plug in my my computer. Hey Bruce, in my office is my black backpack up against the wall there. If you could grab it and help me out. So God goes from, commandment 6 through 10 is a little bit different. This is the shall nots. These are the prohibitions. And I'm gonna unpack a little bit of these, but I need to keep moving. So we're going to circle back to these elements. Could you help me with this? These two things here. Power. But I want to tell you a little bit about what the Ten Commandments actually were. We know what the Ten Commandments were, but what were the Ten Commandments? Like what we know 1 through 10, but what function did these things serve? Well, there is a long history of covenantal documents in the ancient world. Thanks, Bruce. There's a long history of covenantal documents. We get records of this in the Hammurabi Code and earlier in the 1400s, 1800 BC. So these covenantal documents, typically the way that they would get done, two parties would come together and they would cut covenant with one another. And this was the strongest legal contract in the ancient world. And it was a legal contract. And it was done in a variety of ways, but it all involved the shedding of blood, the tearing apart of animals, and then the keeping of a record of the contract of what was promised to one another. Now, this was an oral tradition, but there were written scripts that began to get created around about the time the Exodus from Egypt happened in the ancient world. So typically what you'd have is you'd have something called a summary document. And this summary document, I believe, well, in the marriage covenant, it's called a ketubah. No, that's the thing that goes over top of you. But the summary document is, here's a list of clauses, and here's my executive summary up front. Essentially a shortened version of the high points of the main things that it is that you're entering into contract or covenant with someone else for. And when you made a summary document, there are two parties, so there's two copies of this summary document. So if I'm going to give Tim all of my guitars when I die, and we make a contract about this, then he's going to want a copy of it, and I'm going to want a copy of it. And he's going to want to hang on to it because I have nice guitars. I do, yeah. I could have used a better example. But, so, I mean, I have... So when you enter into these covenantal agreements, these are significant, you're getting significant benefits from this. And it involves a huge amount of property and protection. And so I keep a copy and you keep a copy. And this is the way that it was done in the ancient world. And then there's the legal agreement itself. So there's the summary document and then there's the legal agreement. And there's technical phrases for all of this in Hebrew. But the first thing on this legal agreement are the legal stipulations. This is where we get our Western contract law from. Right? We understand this. It's intuitive to us if you've done business or signed a contract in anything and read it, because it happened in the ancient world. It's 4,000 years old. So they have the legal stipulations. The next thing, they have the blessings, or the thing that you get of value. So you don't enter into a contract unless you're getting some perceived benefit from that, right? I entered into a contract on this house because my benefit of it was that I wanted to live here. So, and I need to have a copy of the contract because if somebody comes and tries to move in, I've got this contract that says you can't move in, I'm here, So I have a legal stipulation, I have a blessing, which is the perceived value, and then in the scriptures, the legal stipulations for the Torah are the 613 laws in Exodus through Deuteronomy. That number 613 was compiled by a 15th century AD rabbi named Rambam. And so these are all of the different do's and don'ts and all the technical things that we maybe associate with the law. And then scripturally, the next thing that happens is that, we have curses. So we don't call them curses in our contract law, but if I break my lease, then I pay a fine. And I lose my deposit, and I have X amount of things. Like there's punitive or there's repercussions if you fail to keep your end of the contract. The Bible calls that a curse. But it's the same thing that we have today. Well, scripturally, they did this in Deuteronomy 28, 1 through 14. The whole blessings and cursing of standing on Mount Ebal and Mount Nebo before they enter into the promised land is covenantal language. They're reaffirming the covenant of God as they enter into the promised land. This is the same thing that happens, and then the curses, the big long list of curses. This is the same thing that happens when they cut covenant, God and Abram, in Exodus or Genesis 15. And that's a smaller rendition of this, but essentially the reason why you cut an animal open and walk the blood path in between it is it's saying, if you break this covenant, may what happened to the animals happen to you. So this is covenantal language. So what God is doing here is not an unfamiliar thing. He is saying, I am entering into a covenant with you. This is the Moses covenant. Two parties, two copies, legal agreement. So here's the correct way, I believe, to interpret the Ten Commandments. So we've got tablet 1, tablet 2. We've got Charlton Heston, coming down with the two big tablets, 5 on one hand and 5 on the other, right? Well, this is what the scriptures actually say about the Ten Commandments. Exodus 32:15b. And the 2 tablets of the testimony were in Moses' hand. And the tablets were written on both sides. And on the one side and on the other, they were written. So Moses has these tablets in one hand. There's 2 of them, and they're written on both sides. So really, this is the front and the back of the same piece of stone. So why is there 2 copies? Why are there 2 tablets? I gave it away. Not like it was a very secret question. There's 2 copies, right? I don't know if there's 5 on the front, 5 on the back. It's nice and symmetrical. But there's a front and a back. 2 pieces of stone. There's Moses' copy. And who's the other copy for? God's copy. Now, when I first started pastoring 12 years ago, somebody told me that I could fill out a form and get a ministerial exemption and not have to pay Social Security or Medicare taxes. And so I did that. And it's pretty hard to get. But that's a little piece of paper that exempts me from about 20% of the government's taxation on income that I make from a pastoral role, which I haven't had in a long time. But every year if I file taxes, I have to prove that I have that piece of paper. Otherwise, I'm in some hot water with the IRS. And you can imagine that the IRS is not keeping a good record of that. So it's up to me to keep that copy of the document. And I'm not a very orderly person, but I do have that one piece of paper filed away where I know exactly where it is. I took that valuable piece of paper and filed it away in a treasured place. And if you have, the days are now gone. I guess it's not totally gone now with the digital era. But we hide our important documents. We put our important documents in very important places. We put our treasured documents in treasured places. And it tells us what's in there. If you go into safe deposit box through all of these different layers of security and all this, in Mission Impossible Ocean's 11 kind of stuff, and you open the box and there's a piece of paper, what's your thought going to be? This is an incredibly valuable contract of some kind, right? So this is Moses' copy and this is God's copy. So does anybody know where the copy of the covenant with God gets put? In the Ark of the Covenant, right? Moses puts it there. Does he put both pieces in the Ark of the Covenant? He says the tablets of stone were put in the Ark of the Covenant. So what does this tell us? And this is a significant moment also. What this tells us is that man's place of treasure is the same place as God's place of treasure. That you're storing your most prized document in the same vault of the person that you made covenant with. And who is more likely on this side of things to break the covenant? So this is a significant, I think, a precious picture of God's trust and establishment of melding together of God and his people in covenant. That every time we see covenant, that God cuts covenant with Abram, he cuts covenant actually with Jesus. When he cuts covenant with Moses, I could show you that. That's a really cool teaching in Genesis 15. When he cuts covenant with Moses, he puts the covenant documents in the ark together with him, and then resides in that place. Like it's a very deep, beautiful picture. And we've been going at this for a little while, so I may just skip all of this. I forgot how long this is, because I have a lot left to do. If you guys, so there is one way of interpreting these first 5, is that the first 5 covenantal summations are beliefs thoughts. And not just cognitive ones, like a belief that gets rooted in who you are. That God brought me out of slavery and I will have no other God before him. That I will make no graven images of God. I won't have emptiness in my heart. I'll remember the rest and the holiness, and I will honor my parents. Like, these are beliefs. And then we've got these actions. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't do this. So I want to ask the question, is there ever a connection between what you believe and how you act? Yeah. Thought, neurologically and psychologically, thought is the precursor to action. You may not be cognitive of your thought, but the body can't act unless it processes it to think before you move. Now, it's a subconscious response in a lot of ways, but action requires a preceding thought. So let's just take a look at this. This is an interesting way just to approach these, about no other God but God. So what's the belief here? That there is no other God. I haven't looked at these in 12 years, so I'm not sure my points are as apropos anymore, but we'll go with it. So this whole idea is that there are lots of gods in Egypt, but now there's one God who's actually looking out for you. This is a God who gives you justice. This is a God who's elevating you to the level of being able to read and write and be priests and kings in your own territory. And this is about shifting the frame of mind of many gods that are not even there to the one God who actually is. And that there is no other one that can really bring justice to you on the earth. Because a huge part of God bringing them out of Egypt was about having a God who set them free from slavery, who brought them justice. We have the word righteousness in the New Testament era. God, for we are to God, what is that righteousness passage in Corinthians? That we are to God the righteousness of Christ? The justice. So if the belief in this number one way, if the belief in God who brings us justice, that he makes us righteous, how is that connected to not murdering?
First thing I think is Cain and Abel.
Cain and Abel has a deep, yeah, right?
He took justice.
Cain realized, he took his own, I've acquired this for myself, but Cain realized that the standard for, there's lots of interpretation here, but the standard that God put forth for an acceptable offering was not something that Cain met. And so his solution was not to grow up and to submit or to learn or to grow. His solution was to take down the one that had had the acceptable sacrifice. This is what socialism does. It levels the playing field, not by elevating the poor, but by bringing down the rich. That's a very shallow and one-dimensional analysis of socialism. But murder is absolutely about that. Right? If you're a slave in Egypt, how do you get justice for yourself? There's no court of appeals. You know, there's a court of heaven, but they hadn't read Robert Henderson yet, so they didn't know. So how do you get justice? Well, you murder. This is what Moses tried to do. He tried to set the people free using the system that enslaved them, and that just didn't work. So when you believe that God is your righteousness, you don't have to live as a slave. He's your justice. You don't have to murder. And you may say, well, I don't murder. Well, you know, we're coming up on an election year, and you guys all have Facebook. You know, you murder with your mouths all the time. Right? This is a reality. Why do we murder with our mouths? Well, we're trying to get justice. We're trying to get somebody to agree or put somebody in their place. This whole gotcha one-line culture that we live in is murdering with our mouths, and it's a justice problem, right? And it has to do with the very first thing that God said, I am your God. Don't have any other gods in front of me. Belief number 2, no idols. This is about an image or substitute for Yahweh. You know, The best idols are not the ones that aren't there. The best idols are the things that are actually there that are just not as good as God. It's the little things, it's the little comforts that get really deadly. You may disagree with me, but I don't think that alcohol is evil. But alcohol, as your God, is evil. Alcohol's not the problem. It's you. So, idolatry is about image substitution. Worship is anything you give your heart or your life to in exchange for life. So, how is this connected to not committing adultery? I think that's pretty interesting. Adultery is the number one metaphor in the scripture for idolatry. It talks about the whoring generation, the whole book of Hosea. So, all of this is connected to idolatry. It is the metaphor. So, if you have an adultery problem, raise your hand. No. If you have an adultery problem, I'm not going to be able to get that one back. Take a look at idolatry, right? We're all familiar with sin management. Sin management doesn't work. Managing problems don't work. You have to get to effects. Or you have to get to causes if you're going to touch the effect. This is a little bit of a grid. If you've got an idolatry problem, go and take a look at your idols. If you have an issue with idolatry, then go and take a look at do you love the Lord your God? You can actually work your way back all the way up to the number one commandment by looking at this in this particular capacity. If you're an overachiever and have all the problems. Number 3, the Lord's name in vain. This is about knowing that he's alive and that he answers your prayers, essentially. This is about worship. This is the worship one. This is, I'm not praying to a dead idol. One of my favorite poets is a guy named T.S. Eliot, and he writes in one of his great poems called The Hollow Man. In his last stanza, he says this is what it's like in death's other kingdom, waking alone at the hour when I'm trembling with tenderness. Lips that would kiss form prayers to broken stone. And what he's saying is, this is what it's like in the world where we all walk around with vanity and emptiness. We wake up in the middle of the night, trembling with tenderness. This is an intimate yearning. You wake up longing for intimacy. Your lips that were made to kiss instead form prayers to dead stone idols. You're made for intimacy, but all you have an experience of is vanity to nothingness, crying out to things that aren't real. Well, how is that connected to not stealing? If you really believed that God was alive and he answered all of your prayers, you don't have to live as a slave. You can be a son. You know that God hears your prayers. He's faithful to answer. There's not an emptiness. You're not cultivating a disconnection with God. The people that I know that have given up on prayer have all given up on prayer for one reason. God doesn't answer. I don't ever see. There's nothing. There's no one on the other end of the phone. Their encounter with God is vanity. It's emptiness. So the petitions stop, and then we start taking for ourselves. We start acquiring for ourselves. Instead of growing, we go to get. Instead of growing and maturing, we do it ourselves. I forgot how preachy this week was. We're almost done. Remember the Sabbath. So this one is about Yahweh getting honored when we rest from our labors. Talked about this a handful of times. So I think this is kind of interesting as well. How does this relate to not bearing false witness? If you believe that you resting one day a week and ceasing from all of your brilliant creative endeavors actually gets God honor, how does that connect to not bearing false witness against your neighbor? Well, the scriptures are very clear that the Sabbath is the sign to the world that we belong to God. And if we don't If we don't honor the Sabbath, if we don't say to God, you're the one that gives me the ability to produce wealth, you're the one that I trust for all of this, and I trust you by stopping and just enjoying and resting. If I declare to the world, if I don't declare to the world that, then I'm bearing false witness to the world. What does Chick-fil-A do
Yeah, you're.
on Sunday? They are not bearing false witness to their neighbor. They're honoring the Sabbath, and it presents to the world that they belong to God every Sunday, and they get all kinds of press, right? We know this. Their honoring of the Sabbath is a testimony to the world that Chick-fil-A stands under God. And when we don't, we bear false witness to our neighbors about who's actually in charge of our lives. We like to bear false witnesses, though. I mean, we like to tell everyone that it's my own strength and ability that got me this wealth. We like to tell everyone that I worked hard for this. We like to tell everyone that I'm a self-made man or woman. But when we rest, we demonstrate to them not the exclusivity of our own ability, but the inclusivity of God's desire to bless.
Would it be a segue to talk about if the Sabbath is a particular day?
Yes, well, we can. The Sabbath is a particular day. It's the day that you honor it. Scripturally, that day is Friday night to Saturday. And, humans have a great penchant to ruin everything nice that God gives us. And I think the Sabbath is one of those things that people can ruin in their quest to make a rigid law out of it. The point of the Sabbath is not the day that it's done, it's that it's done on a day. And I do recommend, personally, that's why we do this on Friday nights. I wanted to try and figure out how to do this. I don't do it that well, but I wanted to fit my life into the Bible instead of the Bible into my life. And so I set our family, and we set a rhythm aside for Friday nights to Saturday night sundown. But it just as easily can be done on Saturday or Sunday or Monday if you work on Sundays. If you really wanted to push me on it, we'd have to go a little deeper on that.
No, that's
Those are my opinions, and I assert them as true. But
But the early Christians, right, did the first day of the week, the day of resurrection, is that the?
well, there's a look, if you want to look at the separation between the church and the synagogue. And the Sabbath separation was a big one, moving from a Friday night, Saturday to a Sunday worship. Many people talk about Constantine's role in the establishment of the legality and the scope of Christian tradition. One of the things that happened during that time period is they moved Christian worship to Sunday because there was conflicts with some of the other pagan traditions, and they were trying to get more people into their things, so they moved it off of a day that was in conflict with another particular day. Sunday is a day of worship to a pagan god. In the time of history in Constantine's era, when they moved it to Sunday.
Saturn?
Huh?
Was it Saturn?
No, it's the sun deity. I forget the name of it. But there's a complicated history there with the separation of the Jews. The Sabbath and circumcision are the two big issues that really wedged apart you killed Jesus. Wedged apart the Jewish Christian world. And I will squirrel out. We'll never recover if I keep going. Our Father Abraham book by Marvin Wilson talks about that. There's a couple good chapters about the separation between the church and the synagogue, and it's worth a read if you're interested.
There's another good book out by a guy named John Mark Coleman called Garden City that actually has to do with the Sabbath and actually his practice of it and Friday, Saturday, and it's really beautiful. Some really great stuff.
The Garden City.
Garden City is what it's called.
Cool.
Yeah.
Oh, man. We may need to take a potty break here on this night. You guys don't know how long this is. It's like I took my 3 kids on a 12-mile hike, and you don't know that we haven't even turned halfway yet. Honor your parents. Last one. Honoring your parents is training for honoring God. There's a lot of layers to this, but one particular way. Why do we train our children to listen to us? Because we're right. Exactly. Anyone that's successfully raised children want to take a chance?
Yeah, I raised my children successfully.
Okay. Well, ideally, when a good 2-parent family structure or a family structure that is making the best of the situation that they find themselves in, honoring parents is training for honoring authority out in the world. And if you learn it at home in a place where you're loved, cared for, and protected, then you learn how to extend it to people that don't have that same benevolence. And this is training for how we do this with God. How many people have had a difficult time dealing with God as a father because it was difficult in home with your earthly father? How many people had a difficult time connecting with Holy Spirit because it was difficult at home connecting with the mothering role? Like, aside from reinforcing our culturally constructed gender norms that are not real, like, there's an actual difference between men and women, and there is a reality about how God made humanity in both his image, male and female. So God is both male and female in that image, bearing nature. When we honor mom and dad in a love relationship, we're learning how to honor both the authoritative parts of God and the intimate, loving, blessing, nurturing parts of God. This is training. This is why we do it. And it helps with our complex to need to be in control. So how does this connect with you shall not covet? Right? If you honor mom and dad, then you know that God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, right? You don't have to be going after all of your neighbor's stuff. You don't have to be a slave. You know you're a son. You know the parents that you live in. You're not bearing false witness because you're honoring the Sabbath, which means that you're living in the holiness. It also means that you are connected to God in prayer and in worship. You don't have vanity in your heart because you've not had any idols, and you know that the Lord is your God who brought you out of Egypt, and you don't have any other gods before him. Like, this is our belief structure that fills us with faith so that all the actions flow out of that life of connection. Capiche? Okay. Just we wanted to see another page of text. This is our last page of text, and then we're going to show you pretty pictures. So what happens here and if you need to get up and go to the loo or something, please do. But what happens here is that God comes, does this whole Exodus or does the whole 10 Commandment thing. They build this altar. And then the Lord speaks this in Exodus 24, 1 through 4. The Lord then says to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel, and worship me from afar." This is the origin of the Sanhedrin, the 70 elders, the leaders, and the rulers. So Moses goes up, and they go up a little ways with him. Second verse, Moses alone shall come near to the Lord, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him. So essentially, it's the elders going up to partially up the mountain. The elders are separated from the people. They go up a little ways, and then Moses goes up all the way. That's what's happening here. And so Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and the rules. And all the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words that the Lord has spoken to us, we will do." So again, we see this new model. God tried to speak to them. They were too scared. Now they have a mediated experience with God from the prophet. Okay? And then Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. So Moses, first set of 10 Commandments, Moses writes them down. Okay? We know there's 2 sets of 10 Commandments, right? Second set, a little different. Moses writes down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. Now this is key because I'm going to take you in now, show you some video footage around the mountain and all these different pieces that exist here at this particular mountain, and then I'll lay it all out for you on Google Earth. But this is one of the things that just gets me really fired up about all of this, is that you don't have to argue about, a piece of pottery shard or coin, although coins and pottery shards really do give us strong dating. Like, there are artifacts at this mountain that are large geographic markers that can't easily be erased, that can still give a testimony, and they're in the locations that the scriptures say. So Moses built an altar at the very foot of the mountain, and this is a mountain that had an area around it that was set up to have 2 million people plus all their animals living, and it had to be separated enough so that they could be a profane and a holy district, an outer court and an inner court, so to speak. There's a lot of these different parts and pieces to it, but I'll take you in here now and show you some of this footage. So this is looking straight down here at this feature. I'll show you where this is. But this is inside of a security fence up a little valley along in this mountain at the base of this area called Mount Jebel al-Lawz, the Mountain of Almonds, or Jebel Malqa. There's a couple of different names for it. So this is what the territory around here looks like. Looks like a gully or some kind of a washout, or, So I'm going to come back to this shot here. And this is an interesting structure. In the mid-90s, the Saudi Arabian Archaeological Ministry, I don't remember their name, they came here and they did an examination of this. And I saw a movie in which a guy named Yuri Zarins, who was one of the heads of that department for Saudi Arabia, he was the head of the archaeological department at the University of Missouri. He came and he didn't work here, but he read all of the ministry's findings here. And he was so enraged, and he's a secular guy. He was so enraged by the scholarship, though, because when the Saudi Arabian company or when the Saudi Arabian ministry came here, they only excavated down to about the 10th century BC, and they stopped. So when you dig on layers, the further down you go, the further you go back in time and in history. So they did an analysis of this site, and I'll give you some of their findings here in a second. But what we think this probably is a cattle chute. Any farmers or horse rancher people in here? Any backcountry South Africans worked on something like that? So this is what we think that this is here. A cattle chute and an uncut stone altar. Here's a picture of the altar in here. So one of the things that the Saudi Arabian Department of Antiquities in the mid-90s found and recorded in this area is that they found bone shards of animals, and they found ancient ash heaps or bits of ash in this pit. Now, they didn't date it to the 15th century BC. By this time, they'd already known that this was a possible location for Mount Sinai, and there's a bit of concern in the scholarship of all of this. But I love this picture because you can clearly see that this is not a cut stone altar. That this is hand dry stacked rocks up on top of each other. None of these walls are very tall. They're only a couple of feet tall, or like a meter tall. And the Saudi Arabian Antiquities Department said that their official report of what this structure was that it was an ancient sheep herder's house. But if you look around the edges, you don't see any stone that have been fallen in. That's an odd-shaped house. It's a very odd-shaped house. Well, if it is a cattle chute, the reason that we think it's a cattle chute is that it's well known for thousands of years that if you're going to slaughter a cow, you can't, if you've got more than one to do, then you need to corral them and lead them in. They're large animals. But you have to take them down and you have to turn them. Because if you just put them in a straight line, they'll smell and see the blood up in front of them and they'll freak out and they'll bolt. So the cattle turn is fundamental. And this is from my alma mater. It's the second best equine science or ag program in the United States. So I found this when I was doing the research from Colorado State University. The professor of animal science says that the recommended length for a single file cattle race is between 40 feet and 75 feet. That's how long until the turn. So you, in a cattle chute, you take them down, recommended length according to modern ranching practices, 40 to 75 feet, and then you turn them at a 90 degree, or you do a snake. There's a couple different designs for cattle chutes. But you take them down, you turn them, and right after the turn is the slaughtering spot. But you cannot slaughter before the turn. So I measured this on Google Earth, and this is 71 feet from the start to the turn. So this is my beautiful animation again. We're going to zoom in here, and there's my cow. There's a couple, because it's more than one. Oh, and they're running down the chute. Look at them all. Gonna worship the Lord. I'm glad you appreciate it with the courtesy laugh. So, that was kind of a long fire. So, yeah. So this is an example of, pretty well laid out right at the base of the mountain. A 70-foot turn with a pit at the end of it, an uncut altar where they would have processed things. Here's another overhead video shoot of this. Here's the race here. This is down. This is like a wash off, and you can kind of see the depth. You can kind of see the depth of it. Look at all those other artifacts to the right, though. Yeah. And look right here, it's built up right on the edge. And then it's down 40 feet or so. Huh? Yeah. Here's the altar. Comes right in here. So this is the part that maybe looks a little bit like a house. But you see, there's processing areas. There's places to stand. There's other structures up and around here. This is the beginning of the temple sacrifice at this location. This is the first time that God calls Israel to sacrifice animals, to have a burnt offering, and to do this. This turns into a multi-billion-dollar temple in Jesus' day, replete with splendid gold and all the finest craftsmen, the cedars of Lebanon. But it starts in the desert with uncut stone, and it's sitting there today. If this is the spot. I think it's absolutely fascinating. So, also one of the things that said is that in a little bit later on, at the golden calf debacle, when Moses comes back down, he tells Aaron to destroy the golden calf, and he says he took the powder and he threw it into the river that ran off the mountain. In order to do this, you need water. So this side of the mountain definitely gets runoff today. But this was 3,500 years ago. So man-made global warming hadn't yet decimated this arid community. So there's a pretty strong candidate for a river right there as well. But we saw this view, and I want to go back to it here. This is an overhead shot, and you can see it's not quite a 90. It looks maybe like 60, 70 degree turn. They're about equal distance. But this is a wash-off area. This is a hillside that comes up. You can see just by the presence of all of the stones that are there. And then on the other side, it's quite flat. So we know this is a cattle chute. We know that this is an uncut stone altar up and to the right. But this is a very interesting piece of the puzzle. There are remnants of what looks like marble pillars. There's 9 of them. And there's also a bunch of big other things right in here. So here's some more footage around the mountain. See the pillars? And that's out looking down through the runoff. So you can see clearly a dry riverbed there, looking out. Now this would have been the area up and around here where all the camping would have gone on.
I'd love to sit in animation if you could put the river back in there.
I'll work,
See what happens.
I'll work on that.
Adam, how far is this from the well?
I'll show you on Google Earth. It's on the other side of the mountain. This is an overhead shot. Look at those white stones up there on the right.
What's the importance of the white stones?
Good question. I'll tell you when my video is done because it's my next couple of slides. It just keeps doing this. So here's a more grainy shot of this white remnant. This is clearly a pillar, okay? You don't have to be, I'm not an archaeologist or a geologist or a stonemason, but I've been to the Supreme Court. That's a pillar. Huh? So we also got these bad boys up here. And the question here is, what are these? Well, I don't know why I'm here. I don't know, this was a new attempt at something. I'm going to go back here. Where did I put that? Huh. Thought that I had that scripture written down. Oh, I did. We already looked at that. So we looked at this particular scripture here. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord, wrote early in the morning, and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. So what's that? God said there's, at the base of Mount Sinai, there is an altar for animal sacrifice and pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, why would God have pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel? Well, pillars represent some significant things. And what he's saying here is, I'm drawing you out, I'm making you a nation, and I'm establishing you as 12 tribes, like 12 stars, like 12 governmental entities. And I'm going to place these markers, these 12 pillars of all the tribes of Israel at the worship site, at the altar site, to remind you and to begin to establish you as a nation. You're not just one people, you're 12 tribes. This is the beginning of the fulfillment of the vision that Joseph had all those years ago, that they would be governmental rulers and entities. So each of these pillars are columns to the children of Israel. And what we think these are is, if you're going to cut, these guys were stonemasons, God told them you couldn't make an altar out of cut stone, but he didn't tell them that you couldn't use cut tools on the pillars. In fact, when he said pillar, that meant, hey, make a pillar. Use your cut tools. Use your skills. But if you're going to take pillars and make, I don't know how tall the pillars were. In classic Egyptian style, they'd cut a pillar and then they'd stack them to make really tall. But we don't have, they're all different heights in there. But if you're going to do that, then you need to create a foundation for them to lay on. Right? You can't just stack them. So what we think these are flat foundation stones so that the pillars could be constructed and laid on top of them next to the altar site. So picture a flat area with 12 different, 3 rows of 4 or 4 rows of 3 representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, 12 is an important number in the scripture. There's 12 sons of Abraham through Ishmael. That's a 12 that we don't talk about, but there's definitely a blessing attached to the 12 tribes in the Mohammedans today. There's 12 sons of Abraham through Isaac and Jacob. There's 12 pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. We got that here. We got 12 governors of Israel under King Solomon. We got 12 male goats used in the dedication of the second temple. 12 apostles, disciples of Jesus. 12 baskets of leftover fish and bread. The woman with the crown of 12 stars who gives birth to a male son who's the ruler of nations. 12 foundations under the wall of Jerusalem with the name of the apostles. What's 12? Government, right? It's the number of government. It's the establishing of government. So when God creates the worship ritual, gives them a way to worship himself, he says, I'm making a new government with the 12 tribes of Israel.
I don't understand how the 12 represents government.
Really?
From what you said there. Because it could be 12 months, it could be a calendar.
Yeah. Well, except for the establishing of all of the governmental entities throughout the scripture.
Well, he says that, doesn't he say that the disciples or the 12 tribes will rule with him in heaven?
Yeah. And that's why the foundations of heaven are on the 12 apostles and the 12 tribes. The 12 stars in the sky, what do the stars represent on our American flag? How many stars are there? States. States are governmental entities, rulers. Joseph gets a vision of 12 stars. The 12 apostles. The foundation of a new nation around. Did Judah have a tribe? Was he the head of the house? Was Benjamin, Manasseh. All these were the heads of houses. These became tribes. These became governmental systems, rulers of their own heads of house. And so here at the mountain, there are, this is one interesting little piece to this. The smallest tribe according to the census in Numbers is Manasseh, and there's 32,200 of them. The smallest pillar measured, this is according to Jim Caldwell, who told me this himself, who was in there. He was able to sneak in before they could have drones and footage all nowadays. We could probably go and do this and measure, and I'd really like to try it. This was according to his word to me. He said the smallest pillar that he measured was 14 inches. He didn't have time to measure them all. And he said the largest pillar there was about 32, 33 inches. And so his claim was that, well, these pillars represented the 12 tribes of Israel, right? That's what the Bible says. There's pillars at the altar site. So what if the height of the pillar was a representation of the size of the tribe? So you could immediately look and see the biggest tribe is the tallest pillar. That seems like a reasonable thing. So if you take the smallest tribe and you divide it by the number of inches that he found, you get a factor of 2,300, right? And then if you take that factor, does that make sense? If we take that factor, these are the numbers of the tribes. Judah is the biggest tribe. Somebody have their calculator? Somebody divides 74,600 by 2,300. 600 by our factor. The largest pillar was between 32 and between 32 and 33 inches was the largest pillar that he measured.
So what do you divide it
By the factor. So what we're looking for, is there a correlation between the size of the pillars and the size of the tribes? We only have 2 sampling sizes, so it's not much of a correlation. But what's 74,600 divided by 2,300?
32.43.
So the correlation there would be Judah, if Judah was going to be represented, obviously the Hebrews knew inches and not millimeters or centimeters. So what I'm just showing you is the relationship between the size of the pillars and the numbers inside of the book of the Exodus. It's a small detail. We'd need to measure more of them to draw a correlation, but I think it's pretty interesting.
And you said the largest one was 32.
32 inches, according to Jim. So this is now looking, the first shot was up here looking down. This one is looking up. And we're going to now go up the mountain. This gives you a little bit of the perspective of the drop-offs on the back side. I mean, it looks like some heavy rains still get those rocks moving. Yeah. So you may be asking yourself, where did they get white marble? I mean, we didn't do an exhaustive geological survey of this area with our drone footage that I didn't take, but there's not a bunch of white marble laying around, right? It's a particularly unique stone, and it's not in this region. And they were told, if they were told now to build, you can't build an altar with your stone tools, but you can make your stone tools and erect for you a foundation and establish yourselves as a nation to represent your tribes as a pillar next to the worship of God. I can imagine people were all given the assignment, either one from one tribe or, this was a big assignment to find and create what stone can we find worthy of a pillar to be constructed at the altar site. The holiness of this and the excitement surrounding this. Now they get to use their tools. Well, this is fascinating because if you look up at the top, the colors change right about here. You can kind of see that. I don't know if you can see this. This looks a little bit like a shadow or it's not a shadow. It looks a little bit like a cloud. I've got a little bit of a better picture of it. Right up at the very top. This is, do you see how the colors change from the rocks here? This is this pink kind of granite material, and then it gets to this blackened kind of singed looking thing. We talked about that the first week, about maybe this being Mount Sinai because the top of the mountain was burnt because God came down in fire. And then you've got this vein, and it's a vein of white marble on Mount Sinai in the region that's blackened. And Leonard Moeller, and this is in your guys' books, and I can give you a book if you want one. These are pictures. This is up here at this white vein on top of the mountain. It's clearly been quarried. So this is something that was on top of the mountain that was left behind. Why would this get left behind? Imperfections, right? They were cutting it and it broke off, and that's not what we need now. They leave it behind. This is also found in this area. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. It's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 3.5, 4 inches in diameter. Is anyone familiar with the mining techniques of the Egyptians? Probably not.
They've been used to carry it.
Huh?
They've been used to carry it.
No, this was the mining before the Chinese gave us gunpowder. This is how you mined. Is that you chiseled out holes down in the rocks, and then you inserted wooden poles and you poured water in. And the poles would expand and it would fissure, it would crack. So you needed at least 3, and this expansion would weaken the joints between all of these elements, and you would begin to crack them and break them out. This was an ancient mining rock quarry technique.
Yes.
So here's the shot again. Here's the altar site, and they've all been down there. And imagine God says, make pillars according to the 12 tribes, and they all look up and see this white speck up on the mountain and say, let's go find out what that is. And they get up there, and it's white marble, and they quarry it out, and they take it back down.
Stroll down.
That's quite an endeavor, right? This gives new meaning to the Isaiah passage when he says, look to the quarry from which you were hewn, the hole in the rock from which you were dug. Remember Abraham, your fathers. What if Isaiah, just like he's saying, like the shadow of a great rock in the wilderness, what if he's saying, remember at Mount Sinai? Remember when you were created and God said, I'm establishing a nation out of you, and he gave you pillars, and he said, create the pillars, and then you went up the mountain and you dug them literally out of Mount Sinai? Children of Israel who were literally dug out of a rock quarry on Mount Sinai in pure white marble and placed at the base of the mountain? Remember that. Remember the covenant. Does God remind his people to remember the covenant? To look back to the origins, to remember the material that you were pulled out of? There's a literal component to this. And it's fascinating that it's all, this by itself, oh, there's a white thing. Yeah, whatever. But when you begin to see how it's all connected.
And you were saying there were about 2 million people there. 2 million.
Yep.
So how would they carry it down?
They were tougher than we.
These are the things that the Israelites.
Oh, yeah, I guess they've been
Yeah, a little
before.
a 32-inch column.
Yeah.
Give that to Judah. Well, that's easy. So there's some other elements around here. So I'm going to take you up now. I love that I can do this. I'm going to take you up now over here. Because right at the base here, this is the holy precinct, and we'll see where you guys are all sitting is the plains, and we'll see this on Google Earth. But I'll take you here now up to the right. A lot of people think this is Mount Sinai that do this. This is just the early vision of the mountain. There's a much taller peak that's on the backside here. But we'll take you up here now. Picture this, and then right over here, about 800 feet, pretty much straight up, that looks down here, is a plateau that's a really good candidate for where the 70 elders went. And here's some footage from the plateau. So we were just down here. There's the quarry. There's the top of Mount Sinai. This often gets called that. There's a pathway around like this coming up to this location. This is a pretty good candidate for the location of a high plateau where the others came. If you turn, you can see out. Actually, we'll show you that footage next. But when they got up here, it says that they looked up as Moses went up the mountain, and they saw that the mountain was shimmering like emeralds. And Jim and Penny that were there said that they have that when they got up there in the evening of the day, it looked very shimmery. That's anecdotal evidence, but. So we started here and we kind of progressed up, and now we'll turn around and we'll look back. So this is coming up over the little lip, coming down. This is the altar site over in here. It's the water runoff. This is the valley. This is the plains.
Where's the altar site again?
So the altar site is over here. So I love this because this is a very good articulation of the boundary markers that can get placed around the mountain. That this area all out from this road out, huge tracts of land. This is the encamping spot, and this is a very specific location that has good, strong boundaries for the holy precinct, where they put boundaries around the mountains to keep the people from having God break out against them. This right here is, we'll look at this next week. This right here, and I'll show you this video again, this is the site of the debacle on the night of the covenant. This is the division in my interpretation or articulation of this. This is the division between, this is the sacred precinct and where the people are. So they put this worship ritual right up to the boundaries of where they had just walked up to. There's one more element here, and I think we talked about it last week. Jesus met some people on Mount Sinai, or when he went up on the Mount of Transfiguration, he was talking to a couple of people. It was Moses and Elijah. Elijah went to Mount Sinai, so if this is Mount Sinai, then there's got to be an altar site, some other things, but there also ought to be a cave where Elijah stayed. Right? I mean, he went there, he was in a cave, he was there for a little while. Well, here's the cave. Oh, this one has audio. So it's right here. We were just standing right here, looking out, and the video shot straight up that way. Actually, this is the cave. And here's a view from inside the cave. So this is the high plateau. This is the altar site. And this is the site of the golden calf debacle. And it's the river that runs off the mountain. So when Elijah, after he's on Mount Carmel, he comes to Sinai thinking he's the only prophet left, the only one that worships the Lord. And the Lord comes here and tells him, he says, and there's the whole thunder and fire and lightning thing, and we're like, still small voice of God. Well, the last time somebody was at this mountain, it was on fire and there was thundering and the mountain was shaking. But when Elijah gets sent back here, what Elijah had been doing was he'd been trying to do a Sinai experience with Israel at Carmel, calling fire and thunder and things down from heaven, and that didn't work. It killed the prophets and the priestesses of Baal and Ashtoreth, but it didn't change the hearts of the people. So God says, come back and remember the covenant. Sit in the cave and look out over the debacle and remember what I've done. Come back to the beginning of worship. Come back to the beginning of the Sanhedrin, the people that you wrestle and fight against. Come back to the beginning of idolatry and separation. And remember the fire and the power. And he's thinking, I'm going to get another taste of this fire and power. But what happens in this cave? He speaks in a quiet voice. God says it's not in the whirlwind. It's not in the thunder. Elijah has to learn a new way of encountering God. Moses' covenant was about thunder and fire and the demonstration. Elijah needed to do something different. And after that, he begins to pass on his gift. He creates a school of prophets. He does inheritance. And he becomes the man where the spirit of Elijah will turn the hearts of the fathers to the sons and the hearts of the sons to the fathers. Not the Elijah that murders the prophets of Baal and calls rain down on Israel even though God didn't tell him to. There's something that changes for him at this mountain, and God takes him back here on purpose with this view to remember the deep significance of all of these things. Last shot, I think. This is up on the mountain, looking around. It's a 360-degree view from this little summit. So this was the high altar site. So we didn't get up to what I think is the top of the mountain up here. Or I think it's that one, but he's been there 18 times. I've never left my house. So that's what this looks like. That's the mountain site. And if you are able to hang on for 10 more minutes, I'll just show you this on Google Earth. Or you can get up and stretch your legs.
Oh, this is really demanding terrain.
It is.
You've done method climbing and run the long speed. What's the terrain like in terms of what it would take for you to climb that to carry things down?
It would be, those are big 6-8 foot boulders, hand over foot, to go up that washout. That would be a significant,
It's also the heat as well.
yeah.
I remember I went to Israel, and it's just something you don't think about. Like, but even, we were just walking around and everything, just going somewhere for like 10 minutes.
When did you go? What time of year?
August.
August, yeah.
But imagine doing that for.
Yeah. This is a hot part of the world. So here's Israel up in here. Here's the mountain. They're here for the first time in about April. So it's a nice time. This would have been a really beautiful time to be in the wilderness if you just came out for like 2-3 months and then went up to Canaan. That didn't end up happening. So I'll show you this, Heinrich, just because you asked, although he's gone. Oh, no, you're there. So the split rock is here, and then this, I have this view a little bit. But here's the crossing site here. They would have come in, and if I had more time, I'd show you the routes that they probably took to get in here. But once they got to Split Rock, they can't go up to the mountain from here, from this rock location. They can't get up there. So they were probably moved. Oh, I haven't done this in so long. I'll just follow my notes instead of freestyle. So here's the mountain from the side of the sea. And just over this little ridge here is the Split Rock, where we did all this stuff the other day. So I don't know exactly where they went or how they got there, but I made it up for them based on the pathways. So, and it follows essentially the road system that's been developed in there. But they would have walked, in some capacity, they would have walked around these mountains in these regions. There's only a handful of spots they could go. So if it's not this valley, it's the one to the left and out. But it's probably not out into here. This is a larger road, and there is some footage of this guy driving through this territory. This is actually really cool territory. I'm scrolling out now because I saw this. But this is this is just about 60 miles south or 80 kilometers south of Petra. So that's a familiar kind of look. Let's see what this looks like. Big red rocks and so they're headed back. Let's just move ahead here.
$2 million people on this trek.
Yep. So now we're entering From here, we're entering on the back side of the mountain. We are looking at this mountain from the other side. And this is the area that I call the Holy Precinct. So I don't know if any of this looks familiar based on our video footage. But this is the high plateau. We kind of had a drone shot that kind of came off this way. We saw the drone shot looking up to here, had one here. You can see on Google Earth this white thread, this vein. So this is my proposed route to the Exodus and the top of the mountain. And like I told you the first week that this began to get notoriety because Buzz Aldrin, the astronaut, flew over it and saw the darkened peaks from space and then requisitioned military NASA government satellites to go and look at this mountain range. So this burnt top was one of the first things there.
What is that rock?
I don't know. There's some wild claims out there about what it is. This guy has some video, him cutting rock open. One fella named Bob Cornuke claimed that when you go up to the top, you can get this blackened rock and you can cut it open, break it open, and on the inside it's pink, and then there's a black rind around it. Other people have gone up there to do that and haven't gotten the same results. He said he brought it back to a geologist in Boston, but he never published the results. He just talked about that it was a mixture of igneous and metamorphic rock. I don't ever talk about him because I don't think that he's been a reliable source. So I just comment. The scholarship behind, there's a few things that have happened with this that makes me a little suspect about some people's claims. You can do it without all that stuff. But we'll come back down the mountain here a little bit and you can see the altar site. You guys see it here?
Yep.
You can see the pillars and pillars of the 12 tribes. Oh man, I made a model of this. I don't know if it still works. It's probably not very good if it does. Oh, look at that. It used to have colors. I had a lot of time on my hand when I wasn't working after I first got married.
We just need the cow.
Yeah, I got the cow.
Oh, it's there.
I got the cow. I've colored it. So this is just a visualization, right, of the idea here of what that could have looked like. That just fits the pictures of what they're creating. I put these in here because these are some of the other structures that exist here. So the Saudis, and it's not exactly on the right spot anymore. So this is a washout area. The Saudis have put up a security fence that they erected around this area. There's been a lot of growth and development in the region since we first started looking at all of this. All of these homes, structures, and everything have not existed until very recently. If you go back and look at the time frames, this is a recent image. This is 2015, back to 2014, 2012. These were the images that I was working with. Actually, it was 2008 when I started this. So these were the images I was working with from 2004. So the fence was still here, but there was nothing else. There's a little bit of some kind of agricultural thing in this region, but nothing else. But a lot of imagery from there. What else do we have? So we got the fence. We'll take you up to the marble quarry. Right on the top. Looking out, down, back down. See what this does. So this high plateau, this is a pretty good image of what I call the division between the holy and the profane, the sacred and the profane, the holy of holies and the holy place, if you will, along this boundary marker with the Saudi security fence along in here, the altar site. And then the path, this is a relatively not crazy steep path up to the high plateau, which was probably the way that they got up to there. I suppose when I go, we can find out. But this is a pretty good candidate for a location where, the elders would go and be when Moses went up from here to the top of Sinai, whether it's this mountain or this one over here. But if you stand here, you can look down at the altar site and at all the people camped around you. And Elijah's cave is right over. You see all these dark marks right here? These are shadows in our 3D rendering. And I think Elijah's cave is somewhere right in here. Can never really find it. But apparently you can access it from coming down in through here. But those are some of the elements to the mountain here in their proximity. So next week, we'll take you in and I'll show you what's here. Where is it? Right here. What have the Saudis put in behind this fence? Right here. Fenced it off. What's the relationship here to the mountain? And then next week, for our last week, we'll do that, and then we'll talk about the covenant that God gives, and a surprising literal interpretation about the soles of the feet and the promised land of God. So that is it. Thanks for hanging in there tonight.